My name is Emily Bitto. I'm a writer from Australia. I live in Melbourne and I've published 2 novels so far, and I'm here in Prague working on my 3rd novel. So my first novel, The Strays, is set in Australia, in Melbourne. There are kind of 2 timelines. The main story takes place in the past, around the kind of late 1930s, early 1940s, around a group of artists, painters, and the kind of children of that group of artists, the friendships between them all, and a kind of sort of utopian artist community that they try to put together and that inevitably fails. And then the other part is kind of later in the 80s when they kind of come back together again. One of the artists is having a kind of survey show of their work, and they're all kind of forced back together to reevaluate the past and think about the decisions they made and the conflicts between them. And then my second novel, Wild Abandon, it's very different. It's more contemporary. It's about a young Australian guy called Will who's just had his heart broken. His kind of first love has dumped him, and he basically kind of just leaves the country and travels to America. And he wants to kind of go on an American style kind of road trip. He starts in New York City, and he has a friend there, or a friend of his brother's, that he stays with, who's a chef, and he kind of has a really wild time in New York, does some things that are not great, and then he starts his road trip, but he kind of runs out of money, and he ends up in this small town in America and starts working for a guy who has a kind of private zoo. If you have seen the show Tiger King, that kind of thing, which is surprisingly sort of legal in America, where I think they've kind of brought in new laws now, but people were allowed to keep huge numbers of wild animals, tigers and lions and bears and wolves and all sorts of things. So it's kind of based on real private zoos like that, and then bad things happen, basically. The inspiration for The Strays, I mean, I think maybe for both of them, and it's turning out to be the same with this current work, for me I think there's lots of threads that come together, different things that I'm interested in and really preoccupied with, and then I have to find a way to kind of bring them together. They might not necessarily seem like they're related at the start. So I guess with The Strays, I was really interested in writing about artists and the kind of creative process, and particularly the kind of, you know, unequal kind of gender dynamics around the arts, particularly in the past, in that it's set in the 30s and 40s. This idea of the kind of tortured male genius that is still, I think, persisting today, and I wanted to kind of look at that from more of a kind of feminist perspective, I guess. And then I was also really interested in female friendship, in the dynamic of like an only child. I sort of grew up an only child. I do have a half brother and sister, but I grew up essentially as an only child, and I had a kind of best friend who came from a big family. And I was really interested in that kind of dynamic of friendship between someone who was an only child and then a friend who comes from that big family, and the differences between those kind of dynamics. And then I became really obsessed with this actual real artist group that was around in Melbourne in that time, who were kind of known as the Heidi Circle. There was a couple of quite famous artists who were involved in that group, particularly Sydney Nolan, you might have heard of, and they were doing quite sort of unconventional things, the way that they were living, the art that they were making in a time where Australia was very conservative, and they had real kind of risks from the kind of art that they were making and the kind of lives they were living. There were a lot of like obscenity trials going on at that time, you know, art being seized from galleries, and, you know, so it was sort of interesting to me to think about the, you know, the risks that were involved. It seems to me like nothing is really sort of controversial now, well, at least in kind of Western art, but back then you really had to kind of think about what you were going to make and whether you were going to stand up for the consequences. So all of those things I was really fascinated by, and then they all kind of came together. With Wild Abandon, I was particularly interested in exploring the relationship between Australia and America. I guess when I was, you know, at the age when people tend to kind of do their first overseas trip at the end of high school, people were more likely to go to London or Europe, and I co-own a wine bar in Australia, and so I work with a lot of like people who are younger than me, and it seemed to me that it had shifted to from away from kind of young people wanting to go straight to Europe or the UK, and instead they wanted to go to America. And it really made me think about the relationship between Australia and America and the kind of cultural dominance of America now in Australia, and the way that, you know, young people are kind of more influenced by American culture, American music, and so yeah, that was part of what I was exploring there. And then I guess also I'm really interested in the relationship between humans and animals, kind of on an ecological level. So I would sort of think of it as, in a way, a sort of ecological novel that explores, you know, the way we treat animals, the way that we sort of think of ourselves as not belonging to nature, in a really highly sort of capitalist culture, and then, you know, the really exaggerated impact of that, I guess, in really extreme situations. The Australian writing community is great. It's probably mostly concentrated along the east coast, probably mostly in Sydney and Melbourne. I live in Melbourne, which is a very literary city, I would say. It is a UNESCO City of Literature. I feel like I've been really lucky in the community that I've found as a writer. I've particularly some more established, older writers in Australia who have been really supportive of me, and I think generally supportive of, you know, younger emerging writers. And, you know, there's a lot of kind of book launches, festivals, things like that, and generally the writing community is very supportive, very kind of tight-knit. I mean, there's obviously still sometimes a kind of sense of competition around things like prizes and funding and things like that. We don't have a huge amount of arts funding in Australia, so that can make it hard. It's obviously really hard to survive financially as an artist, so everyone's kind of competing for the same small amount of grants and things like that. But in my experience, it's a very, very supportive and inspiring community. So my upcoming book, which I am working on here in Prague, is, I guess, loosely inspired by my dad's experience. So he is Slovakian, and he escaped former Czechoslovakia after the invasion in 1968 and came to Australia, and he kind of landed in a migrant hostel in the outer suburbs of Australia, and sort of 2 days after he arrived, he was working in a factory, the Ford automobile factory, and he made a lot of friends in that migrant hostel who were still friends of his. And during COVID, I started interviewing Dad about his, you know, that experience, and then I started interviewing his friends as well, because he's kind of getting older. I wanted to kind of record that family history, and then, you know, the stories that I heard were just so incredible that I became really obsessed with finding out more, and so yeah, I've decided to kind of write this novel. It's set mostly in Australia in 1969, 1970, around this group of migrants that have fled former communist Czechoslovakia and all landed in this one migrant centre in Australia, and it follows them trying to kind of adapt to their new life, but also with flashbacks to their lives that they have left behind, how they escaped, why they needed to flee, but you know, obviously it's fiction, so it's inspired by these stories I've heard, but also a lot of other stories that I've kind of encountered in my reading and research. Well, if Dad hadn't left Czechoslovakia, I probably wouldn't have been born, because my mum was from a family that's like 7th generation Australian, and she was actually his migrant English teacher in Australia. But yeah, I mean, I guess Dad had to leave. He was involved in sort of student politics during the Prague Spring, and basically had to kind of get out. So I don't know what would have happened to him if he had not escaped. He most likely would have been imprisoned. But yeah, I mean, all Dad's side of the family are still here, and it's been great kind of seeing them again while I've been over here, and seeing what my life might have been like if I'd been born in Slovakia or the Czech Republic. But I think, you know, life is not that different now in Australia compared to here. Yeah. We probably don't have that many traditions that are based on Slovak culture in the family, but Dad cooks a lot of traditional food. He was born in a village that's kind of near the Hungarian border, and I think it was formerly part of Hungary, so he basically puts paprika in everything. He had this dish that he would make us for breakfast when we were kids that he had made up, and he called it a crumpet omelette. So a crumpet is like a very kind of British thing, like this sort of fluffy little, almost like a little pancake thing, and he would fry that up with onion and paprika and put scrambled eggs in it. It was the strangest thing, but we loved it, and then eat it with lots of pickles that he had made himself. So basically, yeah, food, I guess, is the way that I still kind of connect with that part of the culture. I've just loved everything about being in Prague, really. I think my favourite thing has been just being able to have time to get into a routine that's worked really well for me, which is basically writing in the morning. I've got a lot of writing done while I've been here. The apartment is absolutely beautiful, so it's a real pleasure to just sit and write in that space. And then in the afternoon, I've just kind of gone out and done a lot of just walking around the city, exploring different neighbourhoods, and just seeing all the absolutely beautiful buildings and architecture and bridges and the river, and yeah, that's just been my favourite thing. You're going to have a great time. Prague is beautiful. I would say just get out and explore, you know, all the different parts of the city, because when I first arrived, I spent most time in the kind of old town centre, which is incredibly beautiful, but it's been actually quite interesting exploring other neighbourhoods and seeing how different parts of the city are, how, you know, vibrant the city is. I guess try and find a balance between being productive and enjoying the city. It's always really hard in these residencies, because on the one hand you're away from your normal life, you want to get a lot of writing done, but then you also want to take advantage of being in this amazing new place. So try and do both if you can. Thank you for giving me this residency. It's been incredible.